Hello everyone, my name's Laura Snowden and I'm a guitarist and a composer. And my work has been both within the classical field as a performer and a composer, but also within folk music, performing, arranging, writing songs. I was born to a Breton mother and a Cornish father, and I grew up with a lot of Celtic music in the house, and also the music of many wonderful songwriters. And so when I moved to London in my late teens, I ended up forming a 5-part folk group called Tirolus, with whom I played not just Celtic music, but also English folk music, some French music, Swedish music, songs by certain songwriters that we really loved, and our own songs as well. And with the group, we recorded an album, we toured around the UK, and we were also very lucky to be invited by John Williams to play at his series in Shakespeare's Globe in London. And sometimes within some of the songs, particularly some of the slower numbers, I would be given my own little chance to play a verse by myself, which would typically involve me sort of trying to play both the melody and an accompaniment for myself at the same time. And I suppose this is what sparked my interest in creating more extended versions of various songs and melodies for guitarists to be able to play on their own. So now I include some of them in my concerts, and I also create scores for other guitarists to be able to use for themselves. So today I'll really be sharing with you my own ideas, my own experiences and my own ways of working when it comes to arranging melodies for the guitar. And I really love arranging because I feel that it's something that is so creative. It gives you the chance to be really personal, to be really expressive, but without having to come up, with the starting point itself. But it's still something I think incredibly creative and wonderfully rewarding. So let's get started on today's lesson, arranging for guitar. I'll start by talking about 3 general principles that I find really helpful to bear in mind when I'm making an arrangement. The first one is actually, don't be afraid to keep it really simple. For me, a lot of the beauty of, especially with folk melodies, is often just the melody itself being so beautiful in itself. And I find that just hearing somebody play a wonderful melody in a really expressive and personal way can already be, I think, a really gorgeous and moving experience. So a lot of this work, for me at least, is about actually giving that melody space and giving yourself kind of the space around it to actually be able to play it really expressively. Number 2, there's no right or wrong. I think the beauty of this work is that it's really about your personal preference and it's kind of your creativity that's allowed to shine. I'm sure if we were all given the same melody to arrange, we'd all come up with really different ideas based on our own personal tastes and our own experiences. And actually, if you listen to, for example, the same folk melody sung by different singers, you'll probably hear a huge variety in the speed, the feel of it, the ornamentation, the harmony, probably even variations in the melody itself. So it's not as though there's even always a kind of correct version of the original melody when you're looking at folk tunes. And actually it's interesting to think that, for example, Benjamin Britten, when he was arranging folk melodies, obviously he did that in a very Brittany way. He kind of Benjamin Brittanized them within his own musical language that's really very different from perhaps how a traditional violinist might play them. So again, that's sort of down to your personal taste and what you're trying to achieve. The third principle is that you learn by doing. So I'm also a composer, and I find that when I'm composing, I kind of end up having to write quite a lot of rubbish before I get to any of the good stuff. And I think the same kind of applies with arranging. It's very much a matter of trial and error. So I suppose the important thing, if you can, is to try and really enjoy the process and sort of be really interested in the different roads that you go down. And actually, if you come up with something that you think, well, that really doesn't work, then I suppose that's to be celebrated, and that's a really good thing because you've discovered one more thing not to do. Before we get started on the main lesson, just a brief word about different ways of working. So the great thing about this is that you don't need to be fluent in reading and writing music at all to do this. In fact, you don't need to do that at all if you don't want, because you can be doing this whole thing by ear. And actually, that's what I would tend to do until it comes to, writing it down for somebody else so that they can play it too. Of course, if it helps you to write stuff down, that's equally valid and could be really helpful too. And remember that nobody's going to be checking up on you and checking your notes and seeing if you've written them neatly. So you can really write things down in short form, as scruffy as you like, just whatever helps you to remember what you've written. So the first variation idea is pretty simple. It's the idea of playing the melody in a different octave. So I chose this rather high octave for playing She Moved Through the Fair, but I could try it an octave lower, and that's going to obviously have a very different colour and quality to it. The second one, which is kind of more of an interpretation thing, but it's still really interesting, is vibrato. Because actually in different musical traditions, you'll probably find very different approaches to vibrato. The same is applying in classical music, that perhaps the way you use vibrato in a Baroque piece might be pretty different from how you use it in a Romantic piece. But I like to see vibrato as an ornament in itself. So I might choose to use a little vibrato on certain notes that can really help to give it some expression and colour. And sometimes I experiment with very quick vibratos, and sometimes I do ones that gradually grow. So you play the note and then you make the vibrato evolve so you have the impression of a crescendo. The third one is slides. Usually I'm more used to hearing slides going upwards, but you could do them going downwards. Again, the different approaches to this are going to be different in different kinds of music. So for example, in traditional Irish music, you're probably quite likely to hear an upward slide combined with a crescendo and this kind of yearning feeling, which is obviously quite hard to achieve on the guitar. But perhaps within more classical traditions, the portamentos or glissandos have a bit of a different quality. So that's a way that you might provide variety. For example, there I just did a little slide at the end. The fourth one is relating to colour and dynamics. So again, kind of depends what type of tune you're playing. But there's a big difference, for example, between using the open strings more. For example, if I play the beginning of this melody in first position and I play, has a kind of more open, kind of resonant colour maybe, or when I play it up here in seventh position, which has a kind of richer, perhaps not richer, but sort of warmer or thicker quality. So that's maybe another interesting thing to think about. The fifth thing could be fingering, which is, again, a little bit related to the colour idea. For example, if I'm playing the melody an octave lower, sounds really different if I go up the fourth string there than if I stay in second position. So that's another way that you can provide some quite subtle variety. The next idea is melodic variation, so actually changing something about the melody itself. For example, the beginning, perhaps instead of doing, maybe I could do, or, and I think when you're doing that, you probably want to preserve the broad structure of the song, so sort of keeping each phrase broadly the same, but within that you can maybe change a couple of notes. So if there's a note that normally goes up, you could try, well, what happens if I go down here, or if I add a couple of extra notes in this gap, and playing around, again, listening to whatever tradition you're working in, to things that might typically be used in that tradition. The next thing is maybe rhythmical variation. So in that beginning, when I'm going, I could try going, for example. So sometimes when you have a long note followed by two short notes, you could try making those short notes even shorter, for example. Or if you have a dotted rhythm, that you make the note after the dot even smaller. Or if you've got three notes, you could try them as more of a triplet rhythm, or maybe more of a, or kind of just playing around with the rhythms that you've been given and seeing what other options you can come up with. So you might be wondering, well, how do I know which chords to use? And some of you might already be very familiar with the idea of working out chords or finding satisfying chord progressions to go with melodies. That might be something that you do a lot of, you have a lot of experience with. But if it's fairly new to you, then I'm just going to give you a few tips now that hopefully will be helpful. It is worth saying that some of this does depend on what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think I referenced Benjamin Britten in an earlier section and his arrangements of folk music. And you can hear that the harmonies that he chose are pretty different from the harmonies that, say, a traditional folk guitarist might choose for the same melodies. So that's really down to you and your own creative and artistic choices. But let's assume for now that you're sticking to a fairly kind of simple and, let's say, traditional type of arrangement, and using fairly kind of common chord progressions for them. So I think in this sense, usually the chords that you're going to be using are going to be pretty simple and diatonic. When I say diatonic, I mean that they're within the key that you're already in. It's likely that if you listen to different versions, you'll hear different options. And actually, I think what you're trying to get to here is not a correct version, because there probably won't be a correct version, depending. If you're arranging a pop song, then sure, there might be a correct version, but if you're arranging a traditional song, not so much. And even then, with a pop song, you might want to reharmonize it and try it in a different way. So you're really trying to explore different options here. But here's a few different techniques that you could use to try and come up with a chord progression that you feel happy with. So one possibility would be simply to listen to a version or lots of different versions of the song and really try to work out what chords are being used, especially if it is a song where the bass is changing quite a lot, trying to pay particular attention to the bass melody and what's happening there. If all of this is kind of natural to you and you don't really feel that you need to analyse it in any way, you could just kind of listen to versions and just let that sink in and influence you, but you don't have to strictly go through and think about it consciously and analyse it. But if this is all quite new to you, it might be helpful to try and do an analysis like that. And then you could copy either the exact chords that you hear in those versions, or you could combine chords from two different versions. Bear in mind, though, that if you're listening to it in a different key from the one you're doing it in, you'll have to keep that in mind and transpose it where appropriate. If you're struggling to work out the chords to what you're listening to, you could try playing along and then basically just doing it by trial and error. If you're struggling with that as well, you could try looking online or in books to be honest, most melodies you'll probably find somewhere on the internet. Somebody's written out the chords. If it's a famous pop song, you'll find loads of versions, but even for more obscure songs, you might find them somewhere in a book or on the internet. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes those versions aren't that great, so worth taking with a bit of a pinch of salt, but it could help as an existing starting point at least. Or what you could do also is just get a score of a transcription that already exists, whether that's for guitar or for some other instrument if you can't find a guitar one, let's say one for piano, and then look at that and see if you can analyse the chords that are being used there. Again, perhaps paying particular attention to the bass notes, and that might help you as well. If you feel up to it, you could also try singing the melody if you pick a particular key. Again, sticking to the suggested keys if you like, and then just try playing along different chords and kind of seeing what seems to work. So literally just doing it through trial and error. So you might be going, oh, the money that of all the money that and kind of thinking it through like that, and messing it up, trial and error, that's perfectly normal. And again, bearing in mind that there are going to be a lot of different options, so it's not like you can only harmonise one, each note can only be harmonised by one particular chord. There's always going to be different ways of doing it, so you're also trying to find something that works to your own ears. If you don't like to sing, you could also try recording yourself playing the melody, on your phone or something, and then trying out different chord options along with it. The most kind of advanced and complicated option would be trying to work out your chords and bass melody with the melody all at once on the guitar. Again, probably through a process of kind of trial and error and just trying things out. Did I like that A note? Maybe I'll try it without. So again, that's just going to be trying stuff, but that is a bit harder than separating it out in some of the ways I've described earlier. When I'm doing these kind of experimentations with chords, what I'm really looking for is, again, something that will enhance the melody and just that feels good. So again, don't be afraid to keep it really quite simple. If you're constantly changing harmony on every beat, it might end up sounding rather clunky, and might then mean that it's harder for you to express the melody in a way that feels really free. So I think I'm always looking for something that gives me the space to express myself, and also just the kind of physical ability so that my fingers aren't too tied up. Usually folk melodies have several verses, so it's likely that when you make your arrangement you might be wanting to play the verses 2 or 3 times, perhaps changing things each time. And so I think it can be helpful to consider, I suppose, the general story that you're trying to tell across this whole song, and how that's kind of going to work structurally. You might be varying the ornaments, the rhythms, the harmony, the melody itself, or perhaps just the feel, the dynamic. There's all sorts of things that you could play with. And I often find that just making 1 or 2 really small changes can make a really big difference to how the thing feels. So don't feel that you necessarily have to change too much in every verse, because it can actually be quite subtle. Hopefully some of this has inspired you to get working on your own arrangements. So remember, stay creative and have fun. I think the beauty of this work is that it's really about your personal preference, and it's kind of your creativity that's allowed to shine. I'm sure if we were all given the same melody to arrange, we'd all come up with really different ideas based on our own personal tastes and our